Hello again. My name is John Eigl. I'm going to be talking today about Mississauga's contribution to the Canadian Allied campaign in Italy during the Second World War. We'll begin with a brief overview of how the campaign began with Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, and then move into a more broad overview of the invasion of Italy itself and the Italian campaign. And then we'll carry on with discussion of four of Mississauga's fallen servicemen, who will begin with an individual who landed in Sicily and was killed on the island. And we'll end with another individual who fought in Italy and ended up falling in the Netherlands after the Canadian military in Italy was transferred to Northwestern Europe. So, without further ado, an overview. So, Operation Husky, the name for the Allied invasion of Sicily, began on July 10th. Sicily had been a critical air and naval base for Axis forces in the Mediterranean, specifically the Italian and German forces. It enabled the Axis powers to control shipping throughout the Mediterranean because it forms a choke point which connected Western Europe with the eastern parts of the world. And so without taking control of Sicily, it was nearly impossible to conduct any shipping throughout or between Western and Eastern Mediterranean. So it was seen as critical to take Sicily and eventually Italy. So the Canadians landed near Cassino, Sicily on July 10th, 43, which you can see in the bottom of this map highlighted in yellow. The fighting progressed quite quickly. Allegedly on the first full day of fighting, the Canadians were held up more by the sheer number of Italian troops trying to surrender to them than by any actual fighting. And so the fighting on Sicily progressed quite quickly. And by July 25th, Benito Mussolini had been, the Italian leader Benito Mussolini had been removed from the government. And by August 3rd, an armistice was signed, which was made public on August 8th, I believe, which formally brought the Italian government out of fighting, out of conflict with the Allies, at which point the German forces had to come in and quickly defeated the Italians and took over the fighting. But we'll get to that later on. The campaign in Sicily concluded on August 17th, with the island being fully liberated and allowing the Allied powers to use the island as an airbase and a naval base, thus opening the Mediterranean shipping lanes for the first time since 1941. During the roughly 1 month of fighting, the Canadian military suffered 2,300 casualties, and 562 of them were fatal. One of those fatal casualties was from Mississauga. So a broader overview of the Italian campaign. As I said, the armistice was signed on September 3rd, 43. So the armistice forced, as I mentioned, Germany to bring in troops to prevent the Allies from simply marching up the Italian mainland, which ended up resulting in about 1/5 of the entire German military being diverted from the Eastern Front against the Soviets to Southern Europe. This was part of the plan, as Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, had long been calling for the Allies to open another front on the Germans because the Soviets had been suffering massive casualties. And therefore, it made it easier for the Soviets to continue the fight. Rome eventually fell on June 4th, 1944, 2 days before the D-Day landings, at which point the public spotlight and the media spotlight in many ways faded away from Italy, which had been the main Canadian campaign. And it led to initially derisive comments where Allied forces in Italy were described as D-Day dodgers, despite having fought for, I believe, almost 11 months at that point through mountainous terrain that was absolutely grueling warfare. Over the course of the Italian campaign, Allied forces in Italy came to actually embrace the term, even going so far as to write songs about being the D-Day dodgers, which they set to a popular German song. I'll make sure to include a link to it in either the bio or we'll have a notification pop up on YouTube. But the actual campaign in the Italian campaign officially ended May 2nd, 1945. However, the Canadian forces in Italy were transferred to northwestern Europe in February of 1945, at which point they joined the rest of the Canadian forces and fought from the Netherlands into Germany. So, without further ado, Private Ferdinand Leonard Nash was born in 1922, and he served with the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, or the HPER. He had 5 brothers and 1 sister. One of his brothers was actually taken prisoner when the Japanese captured Hong Kong. I haven't been able to find his military records, which suggests to me that he survived the war, because fallen service members have their war service files made available much more quickly than those who survived for privacy reasons. The Nash family lived at number 9 Beck Street in Lakeview, and Private Nash worked on his father's farm in Lakeview and hoped to become a mechanic after the war. Private Nash enlisted on July 11th, 1941, and was attached to the HPER on 19th of March, 1942. And underwent further training until the regiment landed in Sicily on July 10th, 1943, as I previously mentioned. Private Nash remained with the regiment until he was killed in action on July 19th, the day after the Canadians captured the heavily defended town of Valguarnera. I'm really sorry. I will probably be mispronouncing other place names. Sergeant Wilburn Webb Chubb, he was born in 1909 on the Alderville, or in Alderville, Ontario, at the Alderville Reserve. He was an Indigenous person, and he served with the Irish Regiment of Canada. Sergeant Chubb is in fact one of 2 Indigenous people who lived in Mississauga that lost their lives during the Second World War. And I thought it was important to bring up his service, because as an Indigenous person in the 1940s, at a time of blatant and rampant racism, it's impressive and commendable that Sergeant Chubb was able to rise from a private to the rank of a sergeant, and would have been given command over groups of men. So I can only imagine he was a formidable character, and I wish I knew more about him. But anyway, so as I mentioned, Sergeant Trump was born in Alderville, Ontario, and he lived there until 1915, when he moved to Clarkson. After moving to Clarkson, he worked odd jobs, including carpentry, farming, and truck driving. He married his wife, Jessie, on November 25th, 1936. And at the time of his enlistment in February of 1940, he had been working on a farm in Clarkson for 15 years. I know from newspaper records that Sergeant Chubb's brother, who also served in the Second World War, also worked on a farm in Clarkson. I believe they may have lived together, but I can't verify that. I have conflicting reports, but I suspect that they lived together and in all likelihood worked on the same farm. So the Chubb family had a very proud military history, which is recorded on the Alderville War Memorial. He was one of 5 sons. 2 of his older brothers served in the First World War, and another served in the Second World War. After enlisting and completing his basic training in Canada, Sergeant Chubb shipped out and, my mistake, completed further training in the UK after shipping out, after completing basic training in Canada. So Sergeant Chubb shipped out of the UK on 23rd of October, 1943, and landed at Naples on the 10th of November. That was when Sergeant Chubb shipped out with the entire regiment. The journey is well documented and will be fully highlighted in the biography I've written on Sergeant Chubb's life and service. So for more detail on that, I'm sure that will be published in the near future. Sergeant Chubb was wounded in action on January 14th, 1944, near Arieli, and succumbed to his injuries on the 2nd of February. Arieli is near the famous town of Ortona, where Canadians suffered extremely high casualties during bitter house-to-house fighting. And I don't believe Sergeant Chubb ever made it to Ortona, but the Irish regiment did serve there. When news of Sergeant Chubb's death made its way back to Canada, there were a number of memorial services. There was a small one in Clarkson, and a larger one was held in Alderville on February 20th of 1944. Lieutenant Paul Leclerc Cote was born in 1914, and he served with the 3rd Battalion of the Irish Regiment of Canada, so the same regiment as Sergeant Chubb. He was born in Winnipeg, but moved to Lakeview as a young child. Lieutenant Cote worked as a department manager at the Eaton Company in Toronto, and enlisted for active service on the 26th of January 1942, and was quickly recommended for his commission on the 2nd of March of 1942. After completing his officer's training, Lieutenant Cote was shipped out to the UK, where he arrived on March 17th, 1943. After arriving in the UK, Lieutenant Cote was attached to the 3rd Battalion of the IRC, with whom he would eventually serve with in Italy, but did not ship out to Italy with the first wave as Sergeant Chubb did. Rather, Lieutenant Cote stayed behind in England as a rear guard, and eventually joined the regiment in Italy on April 15th of 44. Unfortunately, Lieutenant Cote was wounded 15 days later during a nighttime patrol near Villa Luce, which is just outside of Monte Cassino. Monte Cassino, pictured in the top here, is, as I'm sure many of our viewers will know, a formidable mountain range or mountainous peak that was heavily defended by the German military, because it was a critical point in their defense of the last defensive line before Rome. And so both sides understood that it was critical to take Monte Cassino in order to be able to take Rome. And unfortunately, the Allies came to believe that the Germans had been using the ancient monastery on top of Monte Cassino as an observation post. But because it was a designated and protected heritage site, the Germans had in fact not been using it. Despite this, the Allies, believing that they were using it as an observation post, ended up calling it a bombing raid and completely destroyed the monastery. At which point, as it had been destroyed, the German defenders decided that they should make use of the rubble and set up highly effective and lethal defensive positions, which caused even further problems for the Allied forces attacking it. So as I mentioned, Lieutenant Colcote was wounded on the night of the 30th of April, and he was quickly hospitalized on May 1st, but unfortunately he died of his wounds on the 30th of May. The image on the bottom of the screen is the field or war diary entry for the date of his wounding. As you can see, it mentions that he was leading a patrol when he was wounded, and outlines the process by which they recovered him, brought him back. The final individual we'll be speaking of today is Lieutenant Charles William Tompkins, who was born in 1919 and served with the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, or the HPER. He lived at number 3 Oakwood Avenue in Port Credit. He had 2 brothers and 1 sister, all of which served in the Second World War. His sister was with the RCAF. At the time of his enlistment, Lieutenant Tompkins had completed his first 2 of 4 years of vet school in Guelph at the Agricultural College, where he was enrolled in the Canadian Officers Training Corps, the COTC. And he enlisted for active service on 29th of April, 1941, and was fairly quickly commissioned. After completing his training in Canada, Lieutenant Tompkins landed in Gourock, Scotland on the 30th of June, 1941, which was where the majority of Canadian troops landed. It became kind of their home base in the UK, where they would ship to and then be dispersed throughout the region. He returned to Canada in May of 1943, completed his commission on August 14th, and then returned to the UK and was eventually sent to Italy, where he arrived on the 11th of October, at which point he was attached to the HPER. Lieutenant Tompkins fought through Italy until the 10th of March, 1945, when the regiment, along with the rest of the Canadian forces in Italy, were transferred to Northwestern Europe, as I mentioned earlier on in the presentation. After arriving in Northwestern Europe, Lieutenant Tompkins fought his way through Holland until the 17th of April, at which point he was killed during the fighting for the Dutch city of Apeldoorn, which you can see on the map here. That was in fact the final day of fighting for the city, as the German defenders collapsed and withdrew the night of 16th and 17th. Apeldoorn was essential to liberating Arnhem, the much talked about city that was the target of Operation Market Garden, which failed horribly earlier in the war, and Arnhem really was understood as a critical point in the German defenses, and a turning point of the Rhine. So Apeldoorn was an important, strategically important point as well, because it in many ways protected Arnhem. The name Nijmegen will probably also ring many bells to listeners. So in total, even though I ended up not talking about Italy at the end there, Canadian involvement in Italy, just run it down by the numbers. About almost 93,000 Canadians served in Italy from July of 43 until February of 1945. In total, about 5,400 were killed, 19,500 were wounded, just over 1,000 were taken prisoner, for a total of 26,254 casualties, of which, and my mistake, 14 total Mississauga natives were killed during their service in Italy. I must admit, I don't know how many individuals from Mississauga served in Italy, so I can't point to a percentage here. But considering the length of the campaign, I'm sure many Mississaugans served. I hope this has been informative and interesting, and it's been a lot of fun conducting this work, and it's a real privilege to get to know the faces and names who fought for our freedom, as the old, maybe not cliche, but as the old saying goes. Thank you.